Welcome to The Cutting Floor, a weekly podcast of West Cannon Baptist Church. Hi, I'm Emily, and with me is Pastor Zach. This week, your sermon covered Genesis 21. Is there significance in Hagar choosing a wife for Ishmael from Egypt?
Well, it's interesting that Hagar really returns to Egypt, because if we recall from Genesis chapter 12, Abraham goes down to Egypt. This is the first time that he commits the sister fib to the Pharaoh there, because he's afraid of the Pharaoh. And it's on leaving Egypt when the Pharaoh is saying, you know what, I've realized I've made a mistake. I know that your God is great. I'm going to give you all of these things. Some of those things that are given to Egypt in addition to livestock are also some additional servants. Hagar is almost certainly one of those servants, because we read that she is an Egyptian. And so she then goes with Abraham and Sarah. And so there's this sort of bitter irony that it is one of these servants that Abraham gets from this sister fib episode in Egypt that will then be the woman who will be the source of this very bad plan that Sarah concocts to have Abraham sleep with Hagar. And then at the kind of back end of this second sister fib episode, we find, with Abimelech and they're in Gerar, that then Isaac is born, and now there's this problem that's been created that is only a reality because Abraham went down to Egypt and told this lie in the first place. So Abraham has well and truly gotten himself into this mess that's resolved in some, at least initial way, by casting out Hagar, the Egyptian, with her son. Hagar returns to Egypt and procures a wife from her people for her son Ishmael. I think what's interesting in that is it sort of signals to the reader who knows that Moses is the author, who knows that Moses is writing this during the time of the Exodus wanderings, that Israel has a future with Egypt that isn't going to be a pleasant one. There's going to be animosity that develops there. So it makes sense that Ishmael, who is promised that he's going to be a wild donkey of a man who's going to live over and against his brother's hands, going to be raised against his brother, that his wife is going to be from the people that are going to be the thorn in the side for Israel for quite some time. So I think this prefigures for us the future animosity that's going to continue to broil up over time between the seed of Ishmael and the seed of Isaac. This isn't finished. This story is just beginning.
Why does God continue to promise to make Ishmael into a great nation? What is the significance of the promise to Ishmael?
Well, God, for a number of chapters now, has been both alluding to the fact and then overtly promising that he intends to make Ishmael into a great people. But what he tells Abraham here in chapter 21, as Abraham is grieving over the prospect of removing Ishmael from his family and casting out Hagar and Ishmael at Sarah's request, this is grieving Abraham greatly. And God says, understand this, I'm going to take care of Ishmael. I am going to make him into a nation. And then God says, for your sake. So because Abraham is Ishmael's father, because Ishmael has been circumcised, and so is sort of given this initial seeming seal of the covenant blessing, even though Ishmael isn't going to receive the covenant promises or true blessings because he's about to be removed from the covenant, yet God is still going to give some blessing to Ishmael on Abraham's account. And this is really an ongoing fulfillment of the initial promises that were made to Abraham. Those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse, so that you will be a blessing. Well, it's because of Ishmael's proximity to Abraham, and in this case, Abraham's heart, that Ishmael is receiving some of these promises. Now, in terms of the significance of these promises, it's interesting how they're almost kind of a mirror image of Isaac's promises in many respects. And we've talked about this before. Isaac is going to be the father of eventually these people who grow into the 12 tribes of Israel. We read that Ishmael is promised to be the father of 12 princes. Isaac is going to grow into a great nation. Ishmael is going to grow into a great nation. So there are these seemingly paralleled promises, and yet they're distinguished from one another in that Isaac is the child of the promises. So kings will come from him, princes will come from Ishmael. All of the land promises are given to Isaac. Ishmael is going to be one who wanders. He's going to be one who's good with a bow, and eventually his descendants are going to be warring with the Israelite people for the land. So there are some similarities in these promises, and they signify to us the goodness of God mediated through Abraham. But we also see that because Ishmael and Hagar have rejected the promised family, that God is also going to, in many respects, reject them from the line of promise, and they're not going to receive the blessings that come to Abraham.
Is there a theme of sibling cruelty in the book of Genesis?
There is this emerging, developing theme of brother hatred. So we see this in Genesis chapter 4 with Cain and Abel. We see some of this maybe in the Noah account with the different responses of the sons of Noah to Noah's sin. We see it again more overtly here between Ishmael and Isaac, and we're going to continue to see this between Jacob and Esau, and then Jacob's sons are, of course, going to be in fractured relationship through much of the latter chapters of the book of Genesis. I think what it demonstrates for us in the Genesis narrative is the unbelievable corruption of sin on the human heart and the outworking of that in even the most intimate relationships. So if blood is supposed to run thicker than water, one would expect that in these family relationships, we would find the redeeming quality of love overcoming the hatred produced by sin. But in reality, what we find is that sin has so corrupted the human heart that brother hates brother, that they look on one another and they despise one another, even willing to murderously kill one another, to torment each other, to sell each other into slavery, whatever particular permutation you want to look at. The narrative of Genesis conclusively reveals to us that apart from God's redemptive work in restoring us into the new family of God, where we become redeemed brothers and sisters in Christ, that the dominating model of sin in the human society becomes the model of Cain and Abel. And so the ugliness of that is perpetuated again and again and again in these cyclical generations in Genesis. We need a redeemer because otherwise we're left in brother hatred.
What does God's choice of Isaac rather than Ishmael reveal to us about the sovereignty of God in choosing his people?
So in Romans chapter 9, Paul has this argument about God's sovereignty in election and choosing those that he will for salvation and those who he casts aside from his promises. And the classic case that Paul uses there in Romans 9 is Jacob and Esau. But before getting to Jacob and Esau, Paul has something to say about this relationship a little bit between Ishmael and Isaac. So in Romans 9 verse 6, but it is not as though the word of God has failed. For not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel, and not all who are children of Abraham because they are his offspring. But through Isaac shall your offspring be named. This means that it is not the children of the flesh who are children of God, but the children of the promise are counted as offspring. For this is what the promise said, about this time next year I shall return, and Sarah shall have a son. And then it goes on to talk a little bit about the future generations and culminates in Jacob and Esau. But what Paul is saying there is even at the beginning of this relationship of the family of Abraham, we see that it is God's choosing who are the children of promise. The children of flesh, that is Ishmael, he's the one born according to the machinations and the conniving of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar. He's cast out. He doesn't have a part in the redemptive promises that are to come from Abraham. Instead, it's the child of promise, Isaac, the one of God's choosing, the one who was born by the Spirit's intervention. And so even in the initial outworking of Abraham's family, we're given this contrast between those who are born according to the flesh, both physically and spiritually, and those who are born according to the Spirit, both providentially and spiritually speaking. And that sets this pattern for us of what God's sovereignty in salvation looks like, that God elects those who he wills according to his sovereign will, and that those are cast off or reprobated according to his sovereign will. And that's Paul's argument in Romans 9, and he uses both Isaac and Ishmael and Jacob and Esau to demonstrate God's comprehensive sovereignty in salvation.
In your sermon, you didn't have much time to cover the end of chapter 21. Is the issue about the wells, what's going on there, and is Abimelech being truthful in his dealings with Abraham?
So there's this dispute that goes on, and we had to kind of brush over this for the sake of time, but between Abraham and Abimelech, who is the king of Gerar, the Philistine king, over these wells. And Abimelech's there to strike a treaty with Abraham. He says, listen, I know your God is great. I want to be in covenant relationship with you. Please don't deal dishonestly with me, and I won't deal dishonestly with you. And of course, this is coming on the back end of the previous chapter where Abraham was dealing duplicitously with Abimelech. And so Abimelech's trying to stave that off from ever happening again. Well, in the context of those negotiations, Abraham brings up, hey, Abimelech, since we're talking about having some sort of peace treaty between the two of us, how about you address the fact that some of your men are stealing wells from me and my herdsmen? And Abimelech sort of pleads ignorance on this. He says, I had no idea that this was going on. Why didn't you ever tell me? And I think that strains belief. The fact that Abimelech doesn't know what his people are doing and that they're stealing wells from Abraham, I think is probably not entirely truthful on Abimelech's part. And regardless, Abimelech's response sort of demonstrates that he's not exactly going out of his way to assist Abraham. The response should be, oh my goodness, I can't believe that that's happening. Or, you know what? Yes, I did know that was happening. I shouldn't have let that happen. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. I will make it right. Whatever I need to do, I'll take care of. That's not what Abimelech says. He says, why didn't you tell me that was happening? He pushes the responsibility for his men's actions back on Abraham, and then never in the passage does he actually resolve the issue for Abraham in any way. And as the reader, you sort of read it and you're like, Abimelech, what are you even saying? Why didn't you tell me this is happening? That's what he's doing right now. Abraham is telling you, your people are stealing my wells. What are you going to do about it? So it initially provides us some tension that reveals that Abraham is never going to live in this land of his sojournings as peacefully as he might want to. There's always going to be this tension with the current inhabitants of the land versus the one whom this land has been promised. We'll see this develop later. This issue of wells with Abimelech is going to reoccur later in the narrative, and some of these same things are happening again. So the Philistines are constantly trying to take advantage of stealing these wells whenever they can. So they're going to be a troublesome people to deal with. I think the overarching point of the narrative, though, is that Abraham, the promise has been given to him of this land, but he doesn't currently possess the land. The author of Hebrews is going to pull this through and say, Abraham is living in this land as a sojourner by faith. He's been told this land will be given to his offspring, but Abraham is going to have to live as this nomadic wanderer in the land, knowing that he's never going to be able to dwell peacefully as the possessor of the land in his lifetime. He's holding on to these promises by faith. And I think that's a key lesson that we see in this text where Abraham is disputing with a Philistine king about a well. Abraham is not yet the master of the land that his descendants have been promised. He will have to wait on the promises of God and the outcome of God's own good timing.
If you have any questions from the sermon or the sermon passage that you would like to have answered on the podcast, please email them by 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning to questions@westcannon.org. We'll see you next week.